The Lord be, is this on? The Lord be with you. Hey y'all, we're going to say a little after having consumed it grace. One of those things where we know that the Lord is outside of time. So let's pray. Gracious God, we thank you for this food and the hands that prepared it. We thank you for the blessing of being a part of this community that is Christ Church. And we thank you for all those who went before us to make this church what it is today. We thank you for Andy's willingness to come and talk to us about the parish and our history, and we pray your blessing upon him and that you would be in the midst of us this morning. In Jesus' name, amen.
Okay, on behalf of the Bicentennial Committee, Jane Willingham and I welcome you, and we're so glad to see this big crowd. This is just wonderful. Is it not? Okay, I'm sorry. I said on behalf of the Bicentennial Committee, Jane Willingham and I are happy to have this huge crowd. It's a nice problem to have to keep pulling out chairs. I understand there's no coffee. We'll see if we can remedy that in a minute. Well, I'm looking for. Okay.
Welcome. On behalf of the Bicentennial Committee, which has been meeting since last fall and has planned wonderful programs and events, we're excited to, can't still, can you hear me better? Okay. You will never know what I just said then. On behalf of the Bicentennial Committee, which has been working hard since last fall to plan many events and programs for the following year, we hope you'll start attending the forum next week, which will happen monthly, and Russ Henry will be telling us about the early history of Christ Church. Thank you for coming today, and I know you'll enjoy the program. Kay will tell you what to expect.
Okay. Our speaker today was born, raised in Macon, taught school, public schools, and many years at Stratford. Our local historian, my good friend, Andy Lawson. Let's give him a big hearty welcome.
Can everybody hear me? I'm going to try to speak so that nobody will have any problems. And anybody who is dozing off, I'm going to ask you some questions, so you better be ready. Thank you so much for having me. I'm very, very proud and pleased to be here in this wonderful church with you, and I applaud your bicentennial programs because as Christ Church goes, so goes Macon. Today, I want to talk to you a little bit about Macon's early history. And I hope you will forgive me if I mention a couple of family members. Will you forgive me? Because I'm kind of proud of two of them. Some of them I'm not real proud of. And I won't mention who they are. But I am proud of W.J. Danley, who was Macon's third mayor, and he was my great-great-great-great-uncle, the brother of my great-great-great-grandmother. Isn't that right? He would be four greats if he was the brother of the great-great-great-grandmother, Rachel. Anyway, and then another relative I'm proud of, and he's the one whom I'll end the talk with, is Sheriff Jim Hicks. Sue Coggins, I think, knew him, and she looks like she isn't sure about that. But anyway, no, I was just kidding, Sue. He's my great-uncle. So those two uncles will have a bookending effect on the talk today. One at the beginning of Macon in 1830, and one after 100 years in 1923. I never know where to start with Macon history. Do you go back to the mounds, to the Okmulgee Mounds. Many people like to do that, and I guess if we start with them, you have to go back 12 to 13,000 years ago when Indian Native American people were living in this area. The mounds themselves, the ones that you see over here, there's 7 of them. Those mounds go back to about 1000 AD. So that's quite a long time ago. And I think one interesting thing about the mounds is it is estimated that to create most of those mounds would have taken 6 million baskets of clay and dirt strapped to the Indians' backs to create the 55-foot height that many of those mounds have. I think that's something that's pretty amazing. You may not know that in the 1930s, when the mounds were being dug out archaeologically, it was the largest archaeological excavation that had ever been done in America up to that time. There were about 3 million artifacts that were found, are still being found, and there were about 800 men involved in the work. This was in the 1930s under one of President Franklin Roosevelt's programs to hire people and to keep people working during the Depression. So, that's enough about the mounds. There was a Mississippian culture of Indians all the way over to the Mississippi River. And they had quite a strong confederacy and quite a strong culture. And in 1540, let's jump up to 1540, guess who visited this area? The first white male, Hernando de Soto. You've heard of him? How many have heard of him? Boy, this is a smart group. De Soto was a friend of Pizarro, who had conquered the Incas in Peru and had made a fortune and had passed some of it on to De Soto. So he had plenty of money. And he came to this area, as I said, in 1540, and he met with the Indians. The name for the Indians back in that period, we think, was Ikisi or Hichiti. They had not gotten the name Creek yet, C-R-E-E-K. They were Ikisi or Hichiti. And as you might imagine,
Adjusting it so it catches all of what you say, because we
Thank
don't
you.
want to miss a word.
is that better? Thank you, that's much better for me. I'm not good with technology. Several people in here know that, especially Lizzie Clark knows that. De Soto brought with him something that nobody wanted, and that was disease. His pigs and his men spread disease like wildfire. But there were 3 things that he did that were quite notable. The first Christian baptism in America, on the American continent, was right across the river, right over here. We could almost throw a football to the place where the baptism occurred. The first cannon fire in this continent was right across the river, not too far from Christ Church. And it was not a cannon fire that was intended to be warlike, it was a demonstration. Also, De Soto was the first white man to see the Mississippi River, and I think he was buried near it. I think he was killed in one of his expeditions up and down the Mississippi and was buried there. Let's jump up to the 1700s. The Indians over here are no longer called Ikisi or Hichiti. They're called Creeks. Do you know who named them that? The British. And when we mention the Creek Indians, along with that, we mention Fort Hawkins. 1804, 1805, 1806, named for Benjamin Hawkins, who was the Indian agent for George Washington in charge of all Indian affairs south of the Ohio River. Quite a very well-known man. The Creek Indians began to seed land, C-E-D-E for the young people, not S-E-E-D, but C-E-D-E, seed. That means give up or trade for money, which is what they did. And between 1733 and 1835, the Creek Indians made 13 of these cessions, C-E-S-S-I-O-N-S, not S-E-S-S, C-E-S-S. And one of those cessions gave land for Fort Hawkins. The block house, one of the block houses, stood until 1882. Now, the one you see over there today is a copy. It was built in the 1930s. It's not one of the original block houses. One of the last original block house, and by the way, Fort Hawkins was 14 acres of land surrounded by a stockade. But the block house, the last block house, was moved in 1882, was bought by a man named Henry Jones. He moved it down to Main Street, where my mother's mother lived, not too far from her house, and then it burned. But fortunately, somebody drew a picture of it, and so we had a good guide to go by to rebuild it in the 1930s. The first white person born in Fort Hawkins was Mrs. Isaac Winship. Some of you may be kin to her. She was Martha Cook. She became Mrs. Isaac Winship, and she had 10 children, and I think somebody had said, Martha, would you populate early Macon for us? Excuse me if some of you are related to her. Fort Hawkins was a very important deer hide trading place. And for you young people, those are called pelfreys, P-E-L-F-R-I-E-S. Forts in the South that were places where the Indians could come and trade in the early 1800s, they traded deer skins. Now up in New England, guess what they traded? Beaver and mink. So, Fort Hawkins was very important. By the 1820s, the Creek Indians were ready to cede over some land on this side of the Ocmulgee River, where we're sitting today. There were 3 treaties to do so. People don't understand that the Creek Indians were not all together on this. The northern creeks or upper creeks called Red Sticks and the lower creeks didn't get along. The upper creeks did not want to give land to the white guy. The lower creeks were ready to give land and get a lot of money for it. And William McIntosh was one of the Indian chiefs of the lower creeks. And the upper creeks, the Red Sticks, stabbed him and hanged him. And by the way, his Indian name was Sushanugi Kuete, so, which means white warrior. But anyway, those treaties were the introduction to giving some land up on this side of the river where Christ Church is now sitting, where Macon is now sitting. Macon was named for Nathaniel Macon, a senator from North Carolina, and Thomas Jefferson called him the last of the Romans. I don't know what he meant by that. I guess he meant the last of the statesmen. I don't know that we have too many statesmen in the world today, and not in America, so I think we are fortunate to be named for one who was so highly admired by Thomas Jefferson. So Macon was laid out in 1823 on a grid. Streets going north and south, named for trees: mulberry, walnut, poplar, pine, oak, cherry, blah, blah, blah. And by the way, Walnut was the residential street. Mulberry was the banking and legal street. If Chris Clark had been alive in that time, his office would have been on Mulberry Street. Cherry Street was the retail street where my great uncle's store was. He sold clothes, he sold fabric, he had 450 pairs of shoes, and the thing that I envy the most that he sold was beaver skin hats. And this was in the early 1800s now. Poplar Street was the market street. Then you had 1st Street, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, and 11th Street with a park in the middle. That's why it's called Central City Caroline Creighton Park. And many people think Macon was laid out according to the plan of ancient Babylon. No. Babylon had nothing to do with Macon's layout. I don't know where that came from. But, the more you think about it, it would have been a fabulous thing if Macon had been laid out according to Babylon, because Coleman Hill could have been a ziggurat, hanging gardens, and you could be up there and look down onto the beautiful grid of Macon and sort of have this incredible feeling of having a city that was so wonderful, So I'm kind of sorry it wasn't laid out on the plan of Babylon. By the time we get to July the 4th, 1823, Macon had its first Independence Day celebration. And I think this is real interesting. It was celebrated in a log house. There weren't very many houses, substantial houses, but it was celebrated in a log house near Fort Hawkins, and an address was given by Richard Marks to the whole population of the town. Guess how old Richard Marks was? 13 years old. And he gave a stellar and stunning address. And then after that, everybody crossed the river on the ferry, which was where the Otis Redding Bridge is now. They went down to the foot of Mulberry Street, which is where the town square was in the 1820s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and early 70s. And everybody had a barbecue and greens, and 13 toasts were given. Why were there 13 toasts? Somebody from that table right there. Young people, why were 13 toasts given? The number 13. There were originally how many? There you go. Originally 13 colonies and 13 states. Very good. Let's talk about some of the early people in Macon, many of whom were members of this church. The first one that comes to mind is Samurai Rose, for whom Rose Hill Cemetery is named. He came to town at a very young age. He served for 45 years as the editor or the producer, I guess, of the Macon Messenger, which was our first newspaper. He married Lavinia Blunt from Clinton. The Blunts were big deal family in Clinton. It is said that he came home at midnight and he got up at 5 o'clock in the morning. An interesting thing that I found out about Samurai Rose a long time ago, Macon wanted a fair, and they were afraid of smallpox. Somebody had smallpox or thought they had smallpox, and Samurai Rose actually went to the house, checked on this young man who supposedly had smallpox. Samurai Rose said, no, it's not smallpox, it's chicken pox. We can have the fair. And then a week later, he came down with smallpox. And he was scarred for the rest of his life. And by the way, Rose Hill Cemetery, right up the road, where I will be one day if if people will find the gravesite, my family's plot, it's the oldest planned cemetery in the country and an amazing place for a visit and to do a ramble. Another person of great interest in early Macon was Ambrose Baber, B-A-B-E-R. His house right across the street from the parking lot down here. He came from Virginia. He was a medical doctor, and he was a diplomat. He was the emissary to the Kingdom of Sardinia from 1841 to 1844. This would have been under the presidency of John Tyler. An interesting thing about Ambrose Baber was he died of accidental cyanide poisoning. He was tasting various powders and thought that he was safe in ingesting one of these powders, and it turned out to be cyanide. It had been mislabeled. Another twosome in early Macon, and I believe both of these men were at Christ Church, maybe even helped found it, the Ayers brothers, Asher Ayers and James Ayers. Asher Ayers came to Macon when he was 14 years old. These are the guys that built the Hay House. They built the Emerson building on Mulberry Street. They built the row house up on Walnut, which is now 4 units right across from where the terrible fire was. The Ayers brothers did huge, huge things for early Macon. And I think Jenny Rozier is a direct descendant of them. Is she here today? I'm pretty sure, yes. And those two were phenomenal in building the fabulous structures that are still in Macon today. We owe them a huge debt. Including Christ Church, yes. Now, I'm not going to get into anything Christ Churchy because Russ has told me if you get into anything Christ Churchy, I'm not going to like you. And I taught his daughter, and I want to stay a friend of Russ's, so I'm not doing anything Christ Churchy. I'm going to leave that to him next week. Interesting thing, James Ayers had 2 black slaves who worked with him. These were master craftsmen. One was Primus Moore, and the other was Ben Jackson, and they went on to do some pretty fabulous architectural things in Macon. Asher Ayers, his house was right here on the corner where, is that a bank? Right there on the, okay. That was his house. It was an Italianate house, and it was the center of Macon's social scene, really as much so as the Hay House, the Johnston Felton Hay House was. Then I got to mention my great-great-great-great-uncle now, old W.J. Danley, Uncle Billy. The Macon Volunteers were organized in his store in 1825. He was mayor of Macon in 1830 at the age of 26. He sold cloth, he sold shoes, he sold the beaver hats. And we had never known what he looked like. And I happened to find a description of Uncle Billy about a year ago because he met the Marquis de Lafayette, who crossed the Ocmulgee River March 29, 1825. Uncle Billy was in the group of people who met him. And a woman happened to be there, and she was describing all of the dignitaries who were meeting Lafayette. And this is her description of my great-great-great-great Uncle Billy. See if it kind of suits me. He was a portly figure with a round, fair, full, handsome face, with fine black eyes. He is noble and commanding in appearance. Thank you, Ms. Ann Royal of Milledgeville. Bless his heart, he died when he was 32 years old. I just spoke of the Lafayette visit. Now for Sue Coggins, I'm going to do it in French. Are we ready? This was Lafayette's real name. Marie Joseph Paul Yves Roch Gilbert du Motier de Lafayette. How was that, Sue? Now in English, that would be Mary Joseph Paul Ives Roch Gilbert de Motier de Lafayette. But in French, I hope I did it justice. He crossed the river March 29th, 1825, where the Otis Redding Bridge is now. He spoke to a crowd right there at the foot of Mulberry Street. There's a marker that talks about it. And one interesting thing was the mayor, Edward Dorr Tracy, who was another great Maconite, and I think a member of Christ Church. Everybody was a member of Christ Church. Edward Dorr Tracy spoke to Lafayette in 3 languages: Spanish, French, and Creek dialect. And Lafayette said, after he left Macon, and as he toured every one of the 24 states in America at that time, he said, "Nobody spoke to me in the native dialect, the native vernacular, except Mr. Tracy in Macon, Georgia." I think that's a sign of just how educated and how important Macon was in these early days, particularly in the 1820s, 30s, 40s, and 50s before the Civil War. Also in 1825, religious people started waking up, wanting a church. And guess who the first people were? Guess. This one right here. Not this building, which was later in 1851, but Christ Church was formed at the earliest congregation. The Episcopalians, the Baptists, the Methodists, and the Presbyterians all got their little groups together, you know. In 1828 was the first hanging. In 1835, Macon had 3,000 people, and there were 4 steamboats that made regular runs from Darien to Macon to pick up cotton. In the 1830s, there was a steady stream of Northerners coming into Macon. I wanted to say Yankees, but I'm just going to say Northerners. One of the most important was Jeremiah Coles, who built a house right across the street. That house is now out on Riverly Drive. It's the Sam's Cottage, one of the great houses, not just in Macon, but in America. And then his family got so big, he had to build a bigger house up on the hill, which was Old Stratford, called Overlook, built in 1836. Jerry Coles came to Macon when he was 17 years old. He made a fortune in banking and railroads and a couple of other things, but he lost a lot of his money. He went back to New York City. He was from Connecticut. And when the Civil War broke out, guess what he did? And this to me is amazing. He came back to Macon to support the Confederacy. And he started an ironmongering business to create tools and so forth for the southern states. He later went back to New York when there was another economic panic, and he died in New York City in 1877, but guess what? He wanted to be buried in Macon. and he's buried in Rose Hill Cemetery, just a few feet away from Elam Alexander, who designed his wonderful house, well, really both of his houses, the cottage out on Rivoli and Old Stratford. Coles gave $1,000 to help start Wesleyan. This was in 1835. I don't know how much $1,000 in 1835 would be today, but I'm guessing it would be probably 20 times that. I'm not sure. In the 1840s, downtown Macon was ruined by several fires. On Cherry Street particularly, 16 buildings were destroyed. On New Year's Day of 1842, our city election was marred by a group of men who broke into the courthouse and destroyed some ballots. They weren't happy with the way the ballots were being counted. You know, we complain today about, political falderall and, undercover stuff. I don't know if anybody's ever broken into the doggone courthouse and has, roughed up people, but that happened in 1842. In 1844, there was another fire on Mulberry Street that destroyed 12 buildings. In the 1850s, you know as well as I do, Macon was going through some rough times. Slavery issues, Southern rights, as opposed to national rights or Union rights, Southern rights. And even the weather was kind of weird. In January of 1856, it snowed for a week. 1,000 trees were lost. And then in 1856 was another fire on Mulberry between 2nd Street and 3rd Street. It's now called, well, half of it is called the Washington Block. It was rebuilt in brick, but at the time, these were wooden buildings. And pretty big fire. And a group of boys was playing around in the destruction one day. This was 1856. And if you've heard of Leroy Wiley Gresham, who lived in the house that is now the 1842 Inn, he was playing among the bricks and among the debris of that fire, and a chimney fell on his leg. He never recovered. He was 9 years old. And then the Civil War started, and he kept a diary almost every day for 5 years. That diary is now in book form called The War Outside My Window. It is an amazing amount of writing to come from a young teenage boy. What he said, and mainly how he said it, is astounding. If you've never gotten that book, it's for sale at the 1842 Inn. Historic Macon has them for sale. It's one of the saddest books you'll ever read, because finally, when he was 17 years old, he couldn't stand the pain anymore. His leg had deteriorated, and he kept saying to his mother, "Please saw it off. Ma, saw it off. I can't take it. Just saw it off." So it's one of the saddest stories you'll ever read that ever happened in Macon, Georgia, but it's certainly something that gives you a bird's eye view of the war and what was going on. In the 1860s, we had the Civil War. When the Order of Secession was passed, 100 guns were fired, bells rang, and 1,500 Maconites marched with torches. First Presbyterian Church kept its bell. It was the only church to keep its bell, because there had to be a place where a bell could be rung and people could meet to discuss issues during the war period. The first Confederate flag in Georgia was flown in Macon. Bibb County, in proportion, had more troops than any other county: 3 cavalry, 20 infantry, and 3 artillery groups. The depository in Macon was the second largest in the Confederate States, next to the one in Richmond, Virginia. You probably know who the director of that depository was, William Butler Johnston, who built the Hay House. And by the way, $200,000 in gold coins have never been found, have never been accounted for. That's why I started doing tours in the Hay House. When I was in my teenage years, because I'm not kidding, I turned that house inside out to try to find the $200,000. There's not one thing I want to mention about the Civil War in Macon. There were 3 raids done by the Union troops. They'd come in with cavalry and foot soldiers, and they would make a strike and then sometimes retreat. There were 3 raids: the Stoneman raid, the Kilpatrick raid, and the famous Wilson raid, which actually ended the Civil War. It wasn't Sherman, although he did one heck of a job destroying everything he could destroy. Wilson's raid captured so many things, so many munitions, so many steamboats, so many this, so many that. But when the Stoneman raid occurred on July the 30th, 1864, Macon was ready. We had soldiers out at Walnut Creek near the Indian Mountains, and we stopped them. But before we stopped them, General Stoneman's men shot a cannon, and the shell hit the Cannonball House up here on Mulberry, the home of the Holt family. Mrs. Holt was in her front parlor knitting. The shell hit the second column from the left, went through the front part of the house, over the window, came down on the floor in her parlor, sort of right in front of the old gal, and rolled down the hall. And that's why it's called the Cannonball House. I think it's interesting to know that General Stoneman, the Union general, was the highest ranking officer in the Union Army to be captured. He was captured and an exchange was made with other prisoners. But one interesting thing about the Holts, during the war they went, a lot of the time they went to their plantation in Jefferson County, and they were hoping they would avoid the war. What happened was Sherman came right through their property. And he didn't burn the house, but he cut all the ropes to the wells, he killed all the cattle, he killed all the horses, he did a lot of damage, and poor Judge Holt was hanged, and I'm not kidding now, was hanged 3 times in his backyard. Their Union troops put a noose around his neck, pulled it up, and 3 times 2 of his slaves would run in there and cut it, because the Union troops thought he had gold hidden in the yard, which he didn't. Okay, I'm running out of time. The Confederate Monument, which is now at Rose Hill, largest Confederate soldier of any in Georgia, put up in 1878. I noticed when I was coming down Riverside Drive, it's facing east as if it were praying to Mecca. After the war, Macon became recovered beautifully. Mercer moved to Macon. There was Pionona College. My grandmother was born in 1876. She never threw anything away. She made this. These are newspaper articles from many, many, many years about Macon history. And every time, and she would write over in the margin, Uncle Blah Blah did that, or Aunt Jenny or somebody was a part of that club. So I'm indebted to my grandmother, Miss Minnie, who lived on the corner of Fort Hill Street and Main Street. Her house dated back to the late 1820s. It was a 4-room house. It was extended in 1878 that way. In 1908, it was extended with a second floor when she married for the second time. She's the one, you may have heard me say this before, who walked on water. And she used to tell me, Andy, you know I walked on water. And I'd say, no, you didn't. And she'd say, yes, I did. On the coldest day in Macon's history, January 13th, little mister, I walked on the Okmulgee River because it was frozen. You never doubted Miss Minnie. Wesleyan was gussied up. The original building was encased in a Victorian thing with turrets and towers and everything. And you know, Wesleyan burned on February the 24th, 1963, and that's one of the great tragedies of Macon, Georgia. Oscar Wilde visited Macon. Did you know that? July the 3rd, 1882, he spoke at Ralston Hall, which is now gone. It burned that same time of the cold day because they were building fires to try to unfreeze the hydrants, the water hydrants, and flames went and caught into Ralston Hall and it was burned. But Oscar Wilde came and spoke. Can you imagine? No air conditioning, July the 3rd, no microphone like I've got. And I've never found a diary or any other writing of anybody who visited that, who was there. I would love to find that. One reason he came to the South and insisted on coming to the South was because he considered the South a lost cause from the Civil War, like Ireland was a lost cause and was, being ruled by the English. And there's a cute story. When he got to Savannah, one of the matrons in Savannah was asked, or he asked one of the matrons, well, man, how did you enjoy the talk tonight? And the matron, this grande dame, said, Mr. Wilde, I think you would have made such a better impression if your hair was shorter and your pants were longer. We had a Confederate reunion in Macon in 1887. Guess who was there? Miss Minnie. She left me 2 medals from that reunion with Jefferson Davis's picture on them. This one's pretty dirty. She wore this around her neck from 1887 until 1892 when she married. She wore it every day, she told me, and I don't doubt her, as a teenage girl. This medal, I think, is kind of rare. There's one in the Yale Museum, Yale University Museum, but I'm thrilled to have both of them from that 1887. Can you imagine? My grandmother saw Jefferson Davis. It's like seeing Abraham Lincoln or seeing George Washington and actually being able to talk to somebody who had seen these people. I mean, I was just mesmerized by her description of that reunion down at Carolyn Creighton Park and up on Coleman Hill as well. He spoke to a crowd up on Coleman Hill too. (1892), first streetcar. 1898, guess what Macon celebrated? I'm coming to the end now. 75 years, the Diamond Jubilee. Guess what Miss Minnie saved? The doggone newspaper, the original, and Russ brought me a copy, which I love, but here's the original from 1898, the Macon News for the Diamond Jubilee. And it's fascinating. And you know what? when you look at the ads in here, you cannot believe the vocabulary. I bet there's not a child or an adult in this room who knows the meaning of the word indurated. And it's in the newspaper. It's in one of the ads for wooden fiber board. And they spell fiber, F-I-B-R-E. You see how fancy Macon used to be? It's not real fancy now. That Diamond Jubilee was something else. October 11th to October 14th, 1898, a 4-day affair. Day 1 was Patriots' Day. Day 2 was Floral Day. Miss Bertie Coleman was Queen Flora. Here she is in her carriage in front of Christ Church. And I'm going to leave this up here in case you want to look at it. You know, Miss Bertie lived in Old Stratford. Right next door was Martha Johnston. We couldn't have the celebration with just one of those girls. We had to have both of those girls involved. So they elected Martha Johnston to be the queen of the whole dadgum thing, and Miss Bertie to be just the floral queen on Floral Day. And by the way, on Floral Day, there were 136 floats and carriages in a parade. Day 3 was Trade Day. Day 4 was Macon Day. And on Macon Day, 1,450 kids were up on Coleman Hill with these flashcard things, you know, like you have at a football game. And at a certain point, they put up the Confederate flag. They made the Confederate flag and sang Dixie. Then they put those cards down, put up the American flag and sang the Star-Spangled Banner. Can you imagine trying to get 1,450 kids to do that? Kelly Causey can't. I couldn't. I don't think there's a teacher in here who could. And I would like to know who the woman was. I think her name was Miss Ruth something or other. I'd like to know how she did it. But that was a huge success. You know what the biggest problem was with that celebration? Macon had to pave some of its streets. The biggest job was paving Poplar Street, and they used what was called shell concrete. By 1905, I forgot, Queen Liliuokalani of Hawaii was invited to come to the Diamond Jubilee, and she was in Washington, D.C. trying to get a pension because she had been deposed by some wealthy American, the Dole pineapple people. So Queen Liliuokalani was up in Washington trying to get some money, and she ended up getting $4,000. And after she got that was a lot of money in 1898. When she got that money, she decided, you know, Macon is not on my to-see list. I think I'm gonna go back to Hawaii. Or as Miss Minnie would say, Hawaii. Okay, 1905, President Teddy Roosevelt came. 1909, William Taft came. In 1906, a pretty terrible thing happened. Macon was not a place to be proud of. A mob attacked the jail. They were trying to find a black man named Henry Fuse, who was being held for shooting 2 white men. They never found him because he had been whisked off to Atlanta the night before. But a mob broke into the jail. 1910, street lights on Cherry Street, and guess who pressed the button to turn them on? Little Blanche Neal. Did any of you ever know Blanche Neal Ernest? She lived a long, long time, and she was just a little girl. There were 2,000 people in the crowd watching that. December 1916, the terminal station opened. 1923, we celebrated our centennial, and now in 2024, you all are celebrating your bicentennial, or beginning to, for Christ Church. By 1923, Macon had 12 literary clubs, and also in 1923, which is why I'm ending now, that's 100 years, from 1823 to 1923. And I'm ending in 1923 because another uncle was involved in Macon history, and that was my great-uncle, one great-uncle, my grandmother's brother, Jim Hicks, who was sheriff of Bibb County. And I think he was a pretty good sheriff. So we've gone from Uncle Billy Danley, 1830-something, to Jim Hicks in 1923. And nobody in this crowd has fallen asleep, so I thank you, and I am so thrilled to be here.
Many, many thanks to Andy. I know we all enjoyed it, we all learned something. And next Sunday, we're going to learn about Christ Church. I promise you, you won't see the same food again. We've recycled one time, but we'll have just really a little pickup. So come at 9:30 next Sunday to learn about the beginnings of Christ Church. Thank you. Thank you, Andy.